Cardinal Pell convicted. The top aide to Pope Francis becomes the highest-ranking church leader found guilty of sexual misconduct. We have the latest. Follow through. One of the architects of the Vatican's global gathering on combating clergy abuse tells us what's next. Born Alive Act. Lawmakers shoot down a proposal to protect children who survive an abortion. We have reaction from Capitol Hill. And a call for conversion. Pope Francis has an urgent message for the faithful ahead of Lent. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, February 26, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. A new development in the ongoing Catholic clergy sex abuse saga. We can now report Australian Cardinal George Pell has been convicted of child sex abuse. Pell is the most senior member of the church to be charged with sexual abuse. The conviction happened in December. A gag order prevented us from releasing details until today. Two 13-year-old choir boys said they were assaulted by Pell in the mid-90s. The Vatican says Pell has been banned from saying Mass in public and is no longer the Vatican's economy minister or advisor to Pope Francis. The lawyer for one of Cardinal Pell's victims says her client suffered from shame, loneliness, and depression.
Like many survivors, it has taken me years to understand the impact on my life. At some point, we realized that we trusted someone we should have feared, and we fear those genuine relationships that we should trust.
The victim has asked to remain anonymous to protect himself and his family. Here's what the Vatican had to say.
This is painful news that, as we are well aware, has shocked many people, not only in Australia. As already expressed on other occasions, we have the utmost respect for the Australian judicial authorities.
Earlier this morning, Cardinal Pell was surrounded by cameras and heckled. The 77-year-old cardinal maintains his innocence. He faces a maximum 50-year prison term. His sentencing hearing begins tomorrow. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us. Ed, we just heard from the press secretary. What other reaction are you hearing at the Vatican and in Australia?
Well, there's a lot of shock here, Lauren. I think a lot of people weren't expecting this. They thought Cardinal Pell was very strong in his protestations of innocence and that he would be acquitted. And so there's a lot of shock, but also respect, as the Vatican said, for the Australian judicial system, but also respect for the appeal system too. So they're hoping for that. But also the victim has spoken, has released a statement too, and he's talked about his the depression, loneliness, and struggle that he faced because of this abuse. And so there's a lot of anger directed at the Cardinal who's been convicted about this case.
Can you give us some background of Cardinal Pell and what are his supporters saying in particular?
Right, well, he was chosen, Lauren, by Pope Francis for this job as a sort of Vatican Treasury Minister because of his straightforwardness, his transparency, if you like, and the Pope said many times in private that he liked his honesty. He said that to him to his face, and that's why he was chosen for this job. But I think some say he did his job too well, and he got to uncover financial misconduct and corruption in the Vatican to such an extent that some of his friends who think he could never be capable of committing such a crime, that he was kind of set up, and that people tried to get him out of the Vatican, and they tried to set up these charges. But whether that's true or not, we don't know, of course, but that's what they're saying, and that's what a lot of the people close to him are saying. Right, and one victim is still alive, one is dead, and Cardinal Pell's lawyer defended him by telling the jury that only a madman would take the risk of abusing boys in such a public place. So I'm assuming, as you mentioned, that there is going to be an appeal. Is that going to be a lengthy process? I don't think so. I think there's going to be a hearing on Wednesday when both sides are going to present the more evidence to the judge to affect the sentencing, and then an appeal can take place after then. And they've already lodged an appeal, but they'll get a date for that. And as far as I'm aware, I think that could be within 2 weeks. So the process won't be that long. And I think the Vatican is actually waiting to take any decision on this until after the appeal has been completed.
Thank you so much, Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register.
Thank you, Lauren.
We go now to Australia. Peter Westmore, former president of the National Civic Council, which is an Australian conservative Christian lobby group, joins us now. Peter, you attended both trials, and you say every evidence presented shows that Cardinal Pell couldn't have done this. Then why do you think that the jury convicted him?
I think you have to look at the state of public opinion in Australia. We've just been through a royal commission into sexual abuse of children in religious institutions which focused on the Catholic Church. And for 4 years, there has been endless reports of both abuse and of cover-ups by members of the hierarchy and some religious orders, which extended roughly from the 1970s through to the 1990s, when Archbishop Pell, as he then was, became the Archbishop of Melbourne and put in place procedures to try to deal with this problem.
So are you saying that the jury pool was tainted and they weren't Catholic?
No, I'm not saying that at all. The jury pool were people chosen at random from the Australian public. And the fact that the jury came to this conclusion, contrary to the evidence, in my view, indicates that it's a commentary on public opinion in Australia and the reputation of the Catholic Church. And Cardinal Pell just happens to be the fall guy.
Were you, do you know if people were Catholic who were on that jury?
No. In Australia, nobody knows the identity of jurors. Their identity is not published, and it is illegal for members of the public or for journalists to go to interview jurors, either before, during, or after trials. So we don't know. I do know that the judge did not, in any sense, exclude Catholics from serving on the jury when he was impaneling the jury at the start of the trial.
You've known Cardinal Pell for 20 years. Can you really be objective about this case?
Well, let's put it this way. If I had not attended the trial and I had simply heard on the news or read in the newspapers that Cardinal Pell had been convicted of child sexual assault, I would have reluctantly concluded that he must have been guilty. However, I happened to sit in the court through the course of 2 trials, each of which went for 5 weeks, in which there were over 25 witnesses. And I can say categorically that in both those trials, there was no evidence given by any of those witnesses, or called by the prosecution, by the way. There was no evidence which corroborated or supported the claim of the complainant's allegations.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Peter Westmore, former president, National Civic Council, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The Vatican Summit on Abuse ended Sunday. Church leaders still have a lot of work to do. Father Hans Zellner admits it. He was one of the summit's organizers, and he's a member of the Vatican Commission for the Protection of Minors. Father Zellner briefs our Rome Bureau Chief Alan Holdren on the next steps needed to tackle this issue plaguing the church.
How did the meeting impact you personally?
It had a huge impact on me because I saw people from all over the world. I saw the church leaders here, and in a spirit of prayer, in a spirit of renewal, in a spirit of listening, and in a spirit of taking on this very difficult issue for the church.
So the Pope has asked repeatedly for no effort to be spared in addressing this scourge in the church. Can you honestly say that no effort is being spared?
I cannot say that for every diocese and for every religious congregations. I think this meeting has shown that the Pope has not spared any effort in bringing here to Rome the church leaders in a way that never happened before.
What's stopping the Vatican from implementing measures for bishops holding each other accountable?
The law that the Holy Father, Pope Francis, issued in September 2016 as a loving mother is that law. What we need is a clarity about how this law is applied according to the different dicasteries that are co-responsible in dealing with the issue.
What do you personally think should happen to bishops who cover up the abuses of others?
If it is a severe case of cover-up, the bishop can be dismissed from his office, can be removed from any kind of pastoral activity, or can be dismissed from the clerical state. And we have had such cases.
The follow-up to this meeting has already taken place. A first meeting took place just yesterday between the heads of different departments of the Holy See and also the organizing committee of the meeting. What did you decide will happen insofar as these task forces that have been spoken about?
Yeah, we will now start to look for people who can be employed in that, and then we will need to coordinate their activities, identifying, I would say, according to a list of criteria. One criterion could be that this Bishops' Conference has not yet developed a full-scale guideline, so we go there and help them to flesh that out. Another criterion could be that this church is in a state of denial, and we want them to start discussing this publicly.
So would you say that this meeting was a success?
I would say it was a success, at least in that sense, that when people went away, they were telling me and they were showing that they have understood, but not only in the mind, not only because they got some information, but by the heart, that they know now that they have been transformed. A number of those who were hesitant at the beginning, they clearly spoke about the necessity to work with their brother bishops at home, the bishops' conferences or the religious, and bring this to the ground. Because the church, yes, is one, and Rome is important, but the concrete work has also to be done on the ground.
Father Hans Zollner, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, lawmakers shoot down a pro-life proposal. And President Trump arrives in Vietnam ahead of his second summit with Kim Jong-un. Senate Democrats block a bill to protect babies who survive a failed abortion. The bill needed the support of 60 senators, but only garnered 53. Pro-life groups plan to hold 2020 candidates accountable for their votes. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi tells us more. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. All the Democratic senators running for president voted against the Born Alive Act. The bill focuses on what happens to a baby after a botched abortion. It says doctors and nurses should provide the same care to those babies as they'd give to others born prematurely. This bill would punish doctors if they don't provide that treatment.
It would significantly interfere with the doctor-patient relationship.
44 Democrats voted against the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act.
The bill is solely meant to intimidate doctors and restrict patients' access to care and has nothing to do with protecting children.
Minnesota Democrat Tina Smith worked as a Planned Parenthood exec.
They didn't need politicians looking over their shoulder in the doctor's office telling them what to do.
It is and has always been a crime to harm or kill newborn babies.
But the Born Alive Act would require doctors provide the same resuscitation they'd give to a baby born at that premature age and rush the child to the hospital.
We're talking about the life of a child that is born. So while my colleagues across the aisle are saying this is about abortion, this is about a mother's health care, that's absolutely incorrect.
3 Democrats joined Republicans in voting for the bill. Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, Doug Jones of Alabama, and Joe Manchin of West Virginia.
I know it's political marksmanship, if you will, to put it back up and put them on the board again going into a difficult 2020 election.
The bill's sponsor, Ben Sass, defends the vote.
Picture a baby that's already been born, that is outside the womb, gasping for air. That's the only thing that today's vote is actually about. We're talking about babies who've already been born.
Pro-life groups will target senators who voted against this bill. The Susan B. Anthony list's Jill Stanek was here on the Hill meeting lawmakers before the vote. She tells me it was important to get every senator on the record. Now, President Trump tweeted, "This will be remembered as one of the most shocking votes in the history of Congress." Lauren?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. The House of Representatives is set to reject President Trump's emergency order for more money for his border wall. One Democrat says the declaration goes against the Constitution.
The president's declaration is a phony, fraudulent, and fake national emergency. There is no crisis at the border.
The measure, if passed, would then go to the Republican-led Senate. It's an attempt to revoke the president's executive order to send billions of dollars toward a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. Michael Cohen, President Trump's former personal attorney, arrives for the first of 3 days of testimony on Capitol Hill. A source tells the Associated Press he is set to give a behind-the-scenes account, possibly about Trump's criminal conduct. The White House says Cohen has no credibility after being found guilty of lying to Congress. President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un are just hours away from beginning their second summit. Their first meeting is going to take place Wednesday night in Vietnam, and the focus of this two-day summit is the global security threat posed by North Korea. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. All eyes are on Hanoi, Vietnam, but how much will be accomplished there remains in question. Can peace be reached on the Korean Peninsula? Both North and South Korea are still technically at war with one another. Will Kim Jong-un give up his nuclear weapons? But before any of those talks can begin, some rest after long travel. Air Force One arrived at 9 p.m. local time in Hanoi. President Trump on the ground after a 20-hour flight from Washington. The president tweeting, "Just arrived in Vietnam. Thank you to all of the people for the great reception in Hanoi, tremendous crowds, and so much love." The trek to Hanoi almost 3 times as long for Kim Jong-un, 70 hours by armored train from North Korea through China before arriving in Vietnam ahead of President Trump. He took time to visit the North Korean embassy in Vietnam. Both President Trump and Chairman Kim took motorcades to their respective hotels through a city locked tight with added security. It's worth noting the White House correspondents covering this summit were kicked out of their hotel in Hanoi, where they had set up workspace when it was discovered Kim Jong-un was staying at the same hotel. Now, tomorrow, President Trump will spend the majority of the day meeting with the leaders of Vietnam's socialist government. Then in the evening, he will have a one-on-one conversation and dinner with the North Korean leader. Lauren?
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson says he will sue President Trump over his pro-life policy that would bar taxpayer-funded family planning clinics from making abortion referrals.
Once again, and we've been here before, President Trump is violating the law. This time, he is inserting his politics between a woman and her health care provider.
Ferguson calls the policy a, quote, transparent attack on Planned Parenthood. A federal judge says Planned Parenthood cannot resume performing abortions at a clinic in central Missouri. State law requires health centers providing abortions to have doctors with admitting privileges to local hospitals. The ruling means there is just one abortion clinic left in the state. White House senior advisor Jared Kushner says the U.S. is ready to put forward a new Middle East peace plan. Kushner is currently on a 5-nation Middle East tour. It's a trip that could include the first face-to-face meeting with Saudi Arabia's crown prince since the dismemberment of American journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Wyatt Goolsbee reports from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Jared Kushner says his tour is meant to brief Gulf allies on the Trump administration's plans to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but there's one stop that's almost overshadowing the president's son-in-law's trip, and that's Saudi Arabia. Many are concerned about Kushner's ties to the Saudi crown prince, who U.S. intelligence believes ordered Jamal Khashoggi's murder. I spoke today with Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. He's planning to propose a bill that would require the White House to disclose everything they know about Khashoggi's death.
The American people deserve to have the details. Certainly when you're talking about the death of a journalist under the circumstances that we know about, certainly America's elected officials deserve more information, and I see it as a public right to know question.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is responding to Democrats' criticism, saying, quote, America is not covering up a murder. He adds the U.S. will hold those responsible accountable. Saudi officials continue to deny the royal family had anything to do with Khashoggi's murder. The prominent Washington Post contributor was killed in October after he entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. Jared Kushner will visit Saudi Arabia later this week, but the White House has not confirmed if he will meet with the Saudi Crown Prince. Kushner himself has not said whether or not he will even talk about Khashoggi's death during this trip. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. Iran's foreign minister, the architect of the 2015 nuclear deal, has stepped down. Mohammad Javad Zarif gave no reason for the sudden departure. The move sent the country's stock market tumbling nearly 2,000 points. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo welcomed the news, calling Zarif one of the front men for a corrupt religious mafia. Up next, the author of a new book tells us how the collapse of marriage and the church are hurting the American dream. And Pope Francis releases his Lenten message to the faithful. A new book is exploring the death of the American dream as a social phenomenon, not an economic one. Author Tim Carney walks us through it in Alienated America, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. And Tim Carney joins me now. Welcome back to our broadcast.
Thanks for having me.
Fascinating opening to your book. You talk about the village of Chevy Chase, Maryland, which I am intimately familiar with, as are you, living here in Washington, D.C., and another tiny village just outside of Sheboygan. What is the connection that you found to them and to why so many Americans are or are not alienated?
So these were the not the alienated places. These were the very strong communities that had great outcomes you could measure. People finishing school, people getting married, having families, raising them there. But they were very different. Chevy Chase is very wealthy and left-leaning politically. Oostburg was very conservative and very middle class, but what they both had was really strong institutions of civil society. Meaning, in Chevy Chase, it might be the country club, it might be the strong public schools, it might be the sports teams. It's also, a good Catholic parish and a Protestant church. But in Oostburg, it was almost all built around the churches. It was Dutch Reformed, Christian Reformed church, that sort of thing out there, and strong public schools.
So what you're saying is that in the communities where there aren't strong churches or other groups, you're not as likely to feel connected. I get that, but then you liken it to, or you link it to President Trump and his death of the American dream that caused so many people to vote for him.
Yeah, so when Trump came out and said the American dream is dead, that was one of the more shocking things to so many of us in the press, because no politician speaks that way. And for a lot of us, it seems alive, because we're running
Part
in
of
circles.
Those communities.
Yeah, we're running in these more tight-knit circles. But where the American dream is dead is partly an economic story, but it's mostly about the collapse of those communities. I've got tons of data in the book that show that just your ability to move up the economic ladder, to do better than your parents, that depends on having strong institutions. And for the middle class and the working class, church has always been the most important one.
I love this on page 232. I tabbed it. Secularization gave us Trump without strong ties to their neighbors and civil society. Most importantly, those without a church community are not going to do well.
So that's right. So I'm not talking about the general election. People who voted for Trump over Hillary, most evangelicals did that, most Catholics did that. But in the early primaries, who jumped out, who had never been in politics and ran to Trump? It was largely people who didn't go to church. That doesn't mean they're not religious. The evangelicals who don't go to church were his strongest base. And what I argue is that's because they didn't have something to belong to. And so for them, the American dream seemed out of reach.
Fascinating, fascinating book. Your reporting is really in-depth, and the statistics are riveting. So thank you. Alienated America, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. Commentary editor for the Washington Examiner, Tim Carney. Pope Francis tells the faithful to use the Lenten season as a time for conversion. In his annual message before Ash Wednesday, the Holy Father says, quote, "Let us leave behind our selfishness and self-absorption and turn to Jesus. Let us stand beside our brothers and sisters in need, sharing our spiritual and material goods with them." For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.